En janvier 2025, Donald Trump entame son second mandat en décrétant un état d'urgence énergétique. Derrière cette déclaration spectaculaire se dessine une stratégie à deux tenants. D'un côté, il s'agit de rompre avec toute velléité de lutte contre le changement climatique en relançant massivement la production fossile, en doublant les exportations de gaz naturel liquéfié et en démantelant les politiques de soutien aux véhicules électriques. Mais de l'autre, l'administration républicaine entend assurer l'accès des États-Unis aux minéraux critiques dont dépend la transition vers un monde décarboné. Ainsi, avant même que ne s'enveniment les tensions commerciales avec Pékin, Donald Trump avait-il fait connaître son ambition de ravir à la Chine son statut de premier producteur mondial de lithium. Faut-il parler de rupture avec les orientations de l'administration Biden ? Sans doute celle-ci a-t-elle su imposer l'image d'un virage industriel en investissant massivement dans les infrastructures renouvelables. Mais elle n'en a pas moins délivré un nombre record de permis d'extraction de pétrole et de gaz. Si le nouveau président se distingue de son prédécesseur, c'est avant tout en ôtant tout alibi vert au projet de s'emparer des sources d'énergie d'avenir, sans renoncer à exploiter celles du passé. Pour saisir les évolutions et les enjeux des stratégies énergétiques menées par les États, mais aussi par les entreprises et les mouvements sociaux, Thea Riofrancos travaille à l'articulation de la géoéconomie, des frontières extractives et des politiques climatiques. Politiste, militante écologiste et chercheuse au Climate and Community Project, elle suit depuis plus d'une décennie les mutations de l'extractivisme. Son livre à paraître, Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism, prolonge une enquête entamée en Amérique latine. Elle y étudie la relocalisation des industries extractives dans le nord global sous l'effet de l'impératif de décarbonation. Selon elle, l'extractivisme ne se réduit pas à une opération localisée d'extraction de ressources. Il constitue un régime politico-économique durable, historiquement structuré par l'échange inégal entre centres industriels et périphéries exportatrices, ainsi que par l'externalisation des coûts sociaux et environnementaux. Le concept d'extractivisme vert désigne dès lors moins une discontinuité qu'une mutation. Pour Thea Riofrancos, il englobe à la fois l'intensification minière induite par les technologies et infrastructures bas carbone et les stratégies de verdissement mises en œuvre par les industries extractives, indépendamment de l'usage final des ressources. Ce que la politiste appelle le nexus sécurité-soutenabilité désigne cette fusion croissante entre objectifs climatiques, impératifs industriels et rationalité géopolitique. Il correspond à une nouvelle phase du capitalisme vert, où l'échec des mécanismes de marché incite les pouvoirs publics à soutenir l'investissement privé, notamment par la voie de garanties, de subventions et d'incitations aux relocalisations. Thea Riofrancos se donne alors pour tâche d'inventorier les nombreuses tensions qui émergent dans cette nouvelle géographie de la décarbonation. Rivalité interétatique, querelle de priorité entre la sécurité nationale et les exigences du capital financier, conflit d'intérêts entre les fractions fossiles et renouvelables du capital industriel. Elle s'emploie également à éclairer la configuration géoéconomique actuelle à la lumière de 4 inflexions historiques majeures. La crise énergétique des années 1970, marquée par l'essor simultané du nationalisme des ressources dans le Sud et du discours de sécurité énergétique dans le Nord, le boom des matières premières et l'ascension de la Chine à la suite de la crise de 2008, le virage protectionniste amorcé par la première présidence de Donald Trump en 2016, et enfin, l'industrialisme vert de l'administration Biden. Nous avons demandé à la politiste de revenir sur son travail au long cours, mais nous avons aussi interrogé l'activiste sur les stratégies de résistance à l'extractivisme brun ou vert, et notamment sur le rapport More Mobility, Less Mining, publié en 2023, dont elle est l'une des rédactrices. Notre entretien a eu lieu à New York le 14 mars 2025.
So your work has long engaged with the politics of resource extraction and its ecological implications, from the book Resource Radicals that you published in 2020 to your forthcoming book Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And while your earlier research focused on Latin America, particularly Ecuador and Chile, your new book expands its scope to include the US and Europe. So to start with a broader perspective, how would you define extractivism in the first place? And how do you see it in relation to the longue durée of capitalism, and especially its colonial history and the ongoing dynamics of unequal exchange?
Yeah, so I'm going to start this by going to the origins of my analysis of extractivism, which also takes us to its origins as a discourse. I had the kind of serendipity, perhaps, of living in Latin America at a moment that this discourse was in a way first articulated. And so the first answer to your question is that extractivism, or extractivismo in Spanish, is a situated discourse. It emerged in a particular time, in a particular place, to respond to particular challenges on the left and challenges of political economy and the mode of accumulation in the global south and in the peripheries of the world economy. So first and foremost, it's a critique. It's a critique of the way that capitalism appears in the peripheries of the world system. It appears as rapacious, as violent, as extractive, as the kind of term itself names. But as a mode of critique, it wasn't just externally oriented or oriented towards its object of critique, right? Like the world system, capitalism, in its kind of peripheral manifestation. It also named a divide on the left, right? And I think it's important to kind of retain that kind of local political aspect to it, right? When the activists and left intellectuals, critical intellectuals in Latin America started talking in terms of extractivism, part of what they were naming was a way in which even left-wing governments, even these progressive projects that occurred during the so-called pink tide, which was a moment when there was a lot of left-wing, we could almost call it political hegemony in Latin America, when we had leaders that were self-declared socialists, that were embarking on, in many ways, quite transformative policies. What critics and activists at the time sort of began to focus on was the way that, despite the revolutionary rhetoric in some cases, or the radical rhetoric, there was a reproduction of a mode of accumulation over time, that these leftists had not fundamentally departed from extractivism. And so what extractivism also calls our attention to is the kind of deep tension on the left, not only in Latin America, but also around the world, of how to grapple with the extractive foundations of the world economy, right? And sort of one mode of grappling with that is to kind of articulate left-wing policies that can change the political economy of extraction. Another is to more militantly, more fundamentally, perhaps more getting to the root of things, to oppose extractivism as a kind of mode of accumulation in and of itself, right? So extractivism kind of recalls that moment of political conflict among the left. It was initially this kind of localized critical discourse. And in that process, though, it articulated a political economy of extraction. It kind of drew our attention and draws our attention still in this moment to what extraction or extractivism is as a whole political economy, right? And so in doing that, these scholars and activists, and I say that intentionally, in that it was both a kind of intellectual discourse, but also very much a political discourse among social movement actors, right, who were protesting large-scale extractive projects that were being advanced under left-wing governments, right? And so in kind of this moment of this political clash, what is quite interesting to me, and I think quite relevant to our moment, is that these situated actors kind of brought into the 21st century the discourses of dependency theory, of structural economics, these concepts that you've pointed us to of, for example, unequal exchange, right, or enclave economies. These were concepts that were first developed in large part, but by no means exclusively, by Latin American leftists in the 1960s and 70s. And I say in large part because they were also co-created with third worldist projects in Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East, right? So it wasn't Latin American alone, though for certain reasons that we could discuss, these discourses kind of dependency theory kind of first took hold in Latin America in a way before they kind of fully globalized. And what dependency theory draws our attention to is the position of formerly colonies, then kind of subservient states in the world system or peripheral states in the world system, their position in the world system, which is defined by extractive political economies, whether those are mining, whether those are large-scale agriculture, which may have at certain moments involved chattel slavery, right? And so these extractive operations that are basically about taking primary resources from their place of either, their geological deposits or from where they are harvested in plantations out of these territories and exporting them to originally imperial centers and then subsequently also to kind of like global markets, right? Once we're in a kind of an era of sovereignty. And so you have large-scale extractive projects. They are export-oriented. There is often initially enslaved, coerced, and then kind of cheapened labor that kind of performs the labor necessary to get the minerals out of the ground or to get the cotton, out. And there's this way in which your entire kind of political economy is oriented towards the needs of imperial centers where the manufacturing and the value-added processes take place, and or to kind of global markets in a sort of maybe more abstracted way, right? And so you are dependent because the kind of internal workings of your economy, the needs for certain raw materials, the volumes at which they are needed, the specific raw materials that are needed, those are all determined by productive processes that happen elsewhere, right? And so what you are left behind in these places, in these peripheries, and we could talk about this in the 16th century or today, is resource drain. So your resources, especially if they're non-renewable, on human timescales at least, just like leave your borders. And you are left behind with the kind of a volatile economy that kind of booms and busts along with global markets or along with the needs of manufacturers elsewhere. You are left behind with social and ecological devastation, right? So it's not just unequal economic exchange, it's also unequal ecological exchange. And you are also, there is a legacy in addition of a kind of state apparatus, initially one designed by the imperial core. Then, after sovereignty and independence, there are, of course, like nationalist political movements that make important changes to those systems. But the political apparatus, by design, is to serve this process of extraction, export, subservience, right? So extractivism also calls our attention to the kind of simultaneity of political sovereignty in the global South and economic subservience, like the lack of economic sovereignty, even if politically you are technically sovereign. And yeah, so, I think that I wouldn't want to paint too broad or kind of use too broad a brush to paint this picture, in the sense that I would be remiss to kind of imply that there is no change from the origins of violent colonial encounter to today. And I think we'll get into some of those fundamental changes in the global economy, which have actually very much unfolded in the kind of battlefields of extraction. Like extraction and the dynamics of it and the inequalities baked into it are part of what has actually motivated some of those transformations that in turn have made important shifts in this political economy. But there's quite a bit of continuity, and that's what the initial architects of this discourse were pointing us towards, that across seemingly major changes, whether sovereign independence or the rise of left-wing governments, you have a fundamental continuity in the mode of capital accumulation, and there are differences between how capital accumulates in the peripheries and then how it accumulates globally, or there's differences, but also, of course, connections. So maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So maybe to follow up on your first development with a question about green extractivism, what has been called green extractivism. Since with the global push for decarbonization, these critiques of extraction have taken on a new dimension. So you have differentiated between fossil extractivism, centered on oil, gas, and hydrocarbons, and green extractivism, which is kind of an expansive concept that includes both the mining required for energy transition technologies and infrastructures, as well as the broader greenwashing strategies of extractive industries, regardless of their final end use. And so given that at least about 384 new mines will be needed by 2035 just to supply battery materials, how do these two critiques of fossil extractivism and of green extractivism intersect? And also, do they represent fundamentally different challenges, or are they entangled in similar logics?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I want to kind of pick off from where we left off in this moment in Latin America where these terms were first articulated, and then get into this almost periodization that you're drawing out. In its original usage, if we want to be sort of textual about it, extractivism or extractivismo referred to all of this, right? It referred to the expanding extractive frontier for oil and gas operations in Latin America, and coal as well, so fossil fuels. It also referred to the dramatic expansion of large-scale, industrial-scale mining in Latin America that has a long history, right? The mines of Potosí in Bolivia, when the Spanish Empire was still a thing, helped fund that Spanish Empire. So it's not that mining was new, but there was this extremely important expansion of mining in the 1990s, in the 2000s, under initially deregulatory regimes that kind of encouraged foreign capital investment. And then, as I referred to earlier, that pink tide moment where these extractive projects were seen as vital to economic development and funding of social programs, right? So, but in its origins, activists are contesting pipelines and mines, right? Like, so both of those, sort of hard rock mining or metallic mining and oil and gas. But I will say that even there's a distinction we can make that helps us, I think, with some of the later parts of your question, in that it was really this dramatic expansion of mining in Latin America, and Latin America becoming a top provider of minerals to the global economy and as a top destination for mining-related investment, starting in the 1990s and taking off from there, that I think it intersected with this moment of progressive government and then kind of became imbricated in this intra-left battle. What mining really called attention to was how extremely territorially expansive extractivism is. Because mining, even as in just a kind of physical set of operations, even compared to oil and gas, has just a really large material footprint, right? And there was also a really big push of mining territories that had not been previously subjected to extraction. So we're talking about the Amazon basin. We're talking about the southern foothills of the southern Andes and the foothills and these really magical ecosystems that are cloud forests, just these places that had been relatively protected, in part because they don't, in all cases have oil and gas reserves, or just because for various reasons, states and corporations had in some cases had difficulty fully penetrating, like capital had not, in some ways fully penetrated some of these areas, right? And so what activists are responding to is like the way that mining really just completely transforms landscapes in irreversible ways. And their sites were trained on that, and their sites were also trained on oil and gas and pipelines and the kind of whole support infrastructure for fossil fuels. That's one way to think about it in its origins. I want to maybe just address a couple of other things, because I do think that we can start to see differences, especially over time, when we, kind of think about a moment in which a lot of resource extraction, and this is still the case today, of course, is for fossil fuels, right? And then we think about maybe a future moment, still totally a future moment like that has not arrived, in which we start to reduce fossil fuel extraction and we are primarily extracting for this green economy. Again, I want to be very clear, that's not what's happening now. What we have, in fact, is a simultaneity of fossil and green, right? So they're actually, these two regimes of extraction are happening simultaneously. We have fossil fuels growing and more profitable than ever and in high levels of demand. And then we have new demand, in addition to that, for extraction that serves the supply chains of solar panels or lithium batteries, right? But, if we think about what some of the differences are, especially from the perspective of the left and of kind of critical analysis, but also transformative political projects. There's a way in which a focus on fossil extractivism. So I'm thinking of, for example, these big battles over pipelines in the United States, like Standing Rock or the Keystone Pipeline, you know, in over the past decade. Really like aligned a lot of different types of movements. So you have, of course, climate activists would be opposed to fossil extractivism because of its planetary impacts on the climate system. You would have local environmentalists, also local farmers or ranchers that were concerned about the effect of these pipelines and their pollution, oil spills, et cetera, on local landscapes. You had, in the context that I was referring to, indigenous nations who were contesting the way these pipelines were fragmenting their indigenous territory and posing threats to their sovereignty as indigenous nations. And that created an alignment that sometimes, as I said, like had really unexpected allies, like a rancher or farmer who might be conservative politically, but like allying with like an indigenous nation or an ecological group because the pipeline posed a threat. With green extractivism, which again is extraction for furnishing the raw material inputs to so-called green technologies, which I think a concept we'll talk about a little bit more later, it gets more complicated at the level of alliances and at the level of the kind of like, what is the left project vis-a-vis green extractivism? Because, you know, it's not per se a given that a climate advocate is on board with protests against lithium mining, right? Like that, they may or may not be, right? And so, and I think that has a deeper conceptual implication that's important for us, right? It's not just about the messiness of politics and how this might divide otherwise kind of strong coalitions that join, for example, you know, local environmental and climate activism. But there's also a way in which, for me, that thinking about green extractivism, even while we note and observe that fossil extractivism remains predominant, but thinking about green extractivism, I think forces a deeper reckoning with the extractive foundations of our economic system, right? Because I think that it's imaginable to have capitalism without fossil fuel extraction. That's imaginable to me. We can debate it. You know, there are other scholars and people that disagree with me, but I think it is imaginable with enough state support and with certain political conditions in place that we maybe don't currently have, but it's imaginable to me. It is not imaginable to have capitalism without extractivism. And maybe, and this is the more risky point to make, maybe it's not imaginable to have like eco-socialism without any extraction, you know, something that we'll get into more later. But what I think that if we think about that even the technologies that are going to help us clean the air and prevent everything from localized pollution, you know, from tailpipe emissions on cars to the planetary effects of disturbing the atmospheric system with all these emissions, like even those technologies require extraction. What does that mean about extraction as this kind of foundational to economy and society? And then what does that imply about the possibilities for a truly ecological socialism? Like it raises difficult questions that I think we should talk about, but I think the first approach should be they don't admit easy answers necessarily.
To deepen a bit more your analysis of green extractivism, I'd like to go to the next question about what you call the security-sustainability nexus. So, as we've just seen, you take seriously the historical continuities of colonial conquest and capitalist peripheries in your analysis of green extractivism, and you also try to avoid like a static world system assumption or even a pitfall like geological determinism. And so through this concept of security-sustainability nexus, you examine how nation-states are working to secure the green tech supply chains in the context of global and geopolitical tensions. So could you maybe walk us through this new conjuncture? And also, do you see this shift as a rupture with capitalist greenwashing, or rather as its intensification under new geopolitical imperatives? And how does this emerging nexus differ from earlier phases of green capitalist modernization, which relied rather on market-driven mechanisms like carbon markets, pollution permits, all these tools that environmental economists claimed would like internalize these so-called ecological externalities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first thing I want to say about what I've termed the security sustainability nexus, maybe I'll just define it, and then I'll make my sort of first substantive point about it, and then I have a few other notes. So what I mean by security sustainability nexus is a set of discourses and policies that justify and promote the onshoring of mining into the global north. Yep. We could maybe call it the reshoring in some cases. In the United States, actually, reshoring can be more apt because we actually have had a large historical mining industry. In Europe, it's a little harder to call it reshoring in a lot of cases. It's more onshoring. But what I mean by that is that global north from Canada, US, Europe, UK, these governments in their jurisdictions are attempting to attract extractive capital to set up operations within their borders, to set up a lithium mine, a cobalt mine, rare earths, etc., copper. And this should immediately raise an eyebrow or raise a question, because didn't we just say that actually a fundamental fact about the global economy and its history is that extraction is primarily located in the world's peripheries, right? Not in the kind of centers of finance or industry or high-tech value-added production, right? So, I think that the first implication of, actually, let me restate that. So to just return to the definition for a moment, security sustainability nexus. So I've said it's kind of a set of justifications and policies that bring more mining into the global north, right? And the question is, why would anyone want to do this, right? Isn't it perfectly fine for the global north to, in a way, sit atop the pedestal of global production, in which these more toxic, honestly, conflictual, but also less value-added sectors stay offshore, and those goods can be acquired in the past by colonial intervention and imperialism, and today by trade relations that benefit the global north, right? And that because these resources and the people and nature that produce them are cheapened, right? So you get access to cheap resources, right? So what's the problem? There's a certain set of conjunctures that we may touch on later, so I won't go through the history now, but I think this will be familiar to viewers in the present, that in a certain set of conjunctures, it's turned out that global north policymakers view it as a security imperative to have direct access, meaning territorially proximate access, and as a second best, access in friendly states, right? Whether those are neighboring states, whether those are states we have trade relations with, or have geopolitical alliances with. So either within the national territory or in states that are almost as good as being within the national. Friend-shoring, exactly. Ally-shoring, friend-shoring, exactly. And so, in a certain political economic conjuncture, that the preference for proximity, control, security, and access outweighed, or at least partly mitigated, the prior preferences for cheapness and kind of reliability as in a market sense, right? The sustainability part, we'll get into that more later, but at the very least, and very much so initially, in the kind of starting the late 2010s, we could say early 2020s, a period that almost seems just behind us, but also so close to us, right? This was primarily justified in terms of the green economy. The green economy is geostrategic. It's the cutting edge. We cannot let China dominate it. China has dominated it by constructing very secure supply chains, a lot of which route through its own territory or the territory of states that it has good relationships with, right? And so the way to dominate China, or at least kind of counter it, is to do the same thing within the US, within Europe, right? But this was justified because lithium batteries are the cutting edge technology we all need. They're also the route to the new energy system. They're the key to the new energy system. And just as energy has long had a sort of geostrategic valence to it as a sector, that kind of translated into this way that security and sustainability understood as green capitalism and green supply chains, fused and merged as a very powerful discourse to onshore, right? And part of what made it so powerful is that, and this will bring up some prior things we've already talked about, is that not only national security types, but also climate advocates could get behind this. Like, oh yeah, we want lithium mining in the US so we can get lithium batteries in the US so we can rapidly decarbonize the US, right? And maybe it's not a good idea to rely on these vulnerable supply chains from elsewhere, right? So the greenness of it was important to its political legitimacy and to the way in which it helped stitch together a coalition that was not just about hawkish or nationalism, it was also about climate and green. You know, what's happening now, and we'll get to this, you know, as we talk about contemporary events with Trump, but that sustainability was always the most precarious element because it really had such a justificatory role, and justifications can change, right? And while underlying things stay similar, right? And so I think security was always the most powerful set of political actors, set of motives, the most durable. But they had there was a relationship between the two, especially in when these discourses were first formulated. So that's the security sustainability nexus. I'm just going to say one or two more things about it. The first thing I think it does is challenge the idea, as you yourself just brought up, that extractive frontiers are static, that it's always the same countries, that it's always the same places, that it's always the same inputs that are what define extractive frontiers. And it's actually the case, and this is as much the case with fossil capitalism, and I'll get into that in a moment. Extractive frontiers are mobile. They do sediment, and there's a path dependency and an inertia to them, and that certainly has to do in part with their physicality. Like, they're not just concepts. Like, an extractive frontier is a place you can visit. It has certain resources, it has certain affordances that enable extraction, right? But geological deposits of all sorts, whether minerals or fossil fuels, like, they're in lots of places on Earth, and we keep discovering more of them, right? So as a latent possibility, there's a lot of latent potential extractive frontiers out there. The ones that get selected tick certain boxes around profitability, around geostrategic imperatives, around the specific resource in question and its role in the broader capitalist economy. So there are certainly reasons that we can define and identify as to why some places become extractive frontiers. Certainly also, it's important to name that some people and some landscapes are considered sacrificable. Extraction is a really devastating process in many cases, especially large-scale mining. It's quite irreversible in its effects. So from the perspective of power holders, you also have to just see certain landscapes as either a terra nullius, like no one important lives there, there's no important habitat there, or if there are people and habitats that you are forced to acknowledge, they're sacrificable in the name of the imperative of extraction. And so all of this is to say that extractive frontiers are not, they are sedimented in certain ways, but they're not immovable. There's geographic malleability to where extraction takes place, right? The second extremely important implication, which you've already drawn out a bit, is that it is actually not always the case that extraction only takes place in formerly colonies, then third world, now global south. Again, these designations change over time, but there is actually quite a history to extraction within the global north. It's certainly, for periods that can amount to centuries, been relatively strategic for global north countries to get resources from elsewhere. But there's also really important exceptions to that. And so I just want to speak about one, which is, to answer your part of your question about whether this is a rupture or not. A moment where we saw the beginnings of an earlier onshoring push was in the 70s, during the so-called energy crisis. That was when, in response to high oil prices, a variety of global north states, the UK, the US, top among them, began to explore kind of internal peripheries or internal hinterlands or frontiers for extraction. So that's when you get the North Sea development in the UK, the offshore oil development. You also get more drilling in Alaska in the US. You also get Gulf of Mexico. So that's a kind of a mix of an onshore and a friendshore kind of thing, right? With cutting across borders. But regardless, that in the 70s, was a moment of onshoring and a moment where the extractive frontier of oil kind of expanded more within these other, global north countries. And the 70s actually provide an important precedent and set of logics and discourses, and even in some cases actual policy legacies that have facilitated the contemporary push. So when we talk about ruptures, I think it depends at what historical scale we're operating. If we look very zoomed in, the year by year or the daily news cycle or whatever it is, right? There's an important rupture that onshoring draws our attention to, because it's simply the case that for upwards of, half a century to a century, for the most part, the US and Europe have gotten their minerals from other countries, including some global north countries. I don't want to, again, simplify too much. Canada, Australia, they're settler colonies that they have an interesting history with mining that is for another time. But anyway, a lot of imports from Africa, and Latin America in terms of mining. So to look at that situation and say, we want to change this, so more of our mining comes internally, that is a change, right? And if it's successful, that would be a sea change in one particular set of trade flows globally. However, it's not the first time this has happened. Would not be the only example of like an internal frontier within the global north, which brings me to your last question that I want to address. Very interesting. First time I've thought about this, so I really like the question about, is there a kind of adjacency conceptually, or is there more of a contrast between another way of like internalizing, right? You're asking like, in what way does bringing mining sort of back to the global north or to the global north, which is its own kind of internalization, like how does that relate to or contrast with the idea that capitalism can internalize its own externalities, right? And that's a kind of now almost out of fashion idea, but it's important to keep talking about it because I think it's important history, like this idea that with carbon prices or carbon taxes or cap and trade regimes, we can just force capitalism to price in, to cost in its externalities, and then they actually are no longer externalities. They are internal factors of production that carry certain costs. So like, okay, then you reduce your carbon footprint to reduce your costs, right? Because carbon is now priced. And so it's a kind of proposition very aligned with an earlier moment of kind of green capitalism as an economic but also political project, that capitalism can sort of solve its own contradictions. The contradiction in this case being, what James Conner called like the second contradiction of capitalism, right? That there's a contradiction between capitalism and its ecological foundations because it self-undermines ecologically. Well, if you priced in the ecological externalities or the carbon footprint, then maybe capitalism could internally adjust. It's such an interesting parallel, but difference, right? Because I just explained the logic of market mechanisms as this kind of mode of internalization of externalities. And instead, what we see is a kind of more territorial form that takes and a kind of geopolitical form that takes, right? Where instead of importing, you are becoming more self-sufficient. So you're internally self-provisioning the inputs of the green economy or of the high-tech economy or the semiconductor economy, right? Because there are other sectors where there's an argument for onshoring of raw materials, right? So it's less about markets internalizing and more about states internalizing, right? It's very interesting to see almost this conceptual parallel of what's inside versus what's outside, and how calculi on the part of state or corporate actors shift in terms of what's convenient or strategic to kind of in-house or have external. I mean, there's this even longer debate in the history of capitalism around vertical integration, like what makes sense for a company to do internally versus what's better to do via contract, via markets, via offshoring, outsourcing, et cetera, right? So there's this kind of fundamental kind of question in capitalism about what is a market relationship versus what's internal to a firm, or what capitalists calculate internally versus what they kind of consider an externality, or what states want internally versus not. And there's probably a deeper answer than what I've just given, but I like thinking about those in tandem quite a bit.
All right, I'd like to follow up with a question that explores the link between what you just framed, the security sustainability nexus, and the concept of green capitalism that you introduce in your forthcoming book and that you define in two ways. So on the one hand, it refers to economic sectors and supply chains that are labeled green, for their proven or unproven role in addressing the climate crisis through decarbonization or adaptation. And on the other, it represents a technocratic project driven by profit-maximizing firms and business-friendly governments that seek to foster market-driven innovation through de-risked investment. But as you argue, green capitalism is full of contradictions, and I'd like you to expand on some of these tensions. So how does, for example, the onshoring of extractive industries that you just mentioned in the core both contradict and reinforce patterns of unequal exchange in the periphery? And to what extent does national security clash or align with interests of transnational capital? Is green capital ultimately constrained by low or unstable profitability, as for example the economist Brad Christophers has argued? And finally, how do these multiple contradictions, so between rival states, between state and capital, and also among competing capital fractions, interact and shape one another?
Yeah, I think it's another moment where I think that the end of the last question really, pivots us to this one, right? Because I want to recall that what you mentioned about this idea that capitalism can internalize its own ecological and including climate contradictions through market mechanisms, that is one way to define green capitalism, right? From a more normative, what I mean is a non-critical, a normative perspective, almost like a promotional or booster perspective. Like if I asked someone who is a proponent of the idea that capitalism can internalize its own ecological contradictions, they would kind of call that end state green capitalism, right? And so that's one way to define green capitalism. Another way to define it is polar opposite, and it's in a kind of polarized debate with that first way, right? The second way is critical, and it says, all green capitalism is the greenwashing of capitalism, because capitalism can never internalize its ecological contradiction. So any claim that it can, or any attempt to implement market mechanisms to encourage it to do so, merely kind of like puts a green veil on a fundamentally ecologically unsustainable system, right? And while I definitely see a virtue or some important critical traction that second, more critical definition of green capitalism gives us, I almost feel it's like too intertwined with this like debate with the boosters of green capital. So I want to kind of step away, not in this fake, like I'm above the fray of these political disagreements, but just to kind of start more empirically. Like, if we had to observe green capitalism beyond just greenwashing discourses, like, what is it? Like, what does it refer to? And for me, in this moment at least, and I think I'm offering a historically circumscribed definition, not like a transhistorical one, but in this moment of maybe energy transition that's really better thought as energy addition, in which we are seeing new supply chains to furnish the technologies that are required by a renewable or at least a zero emissions energy system. We're also seeing technological developments in the fields of adaptation or of decarbonizing of materials, like green steel, so-called, right? So for me, what's important is the quite material building of productive capacities, of supply chains, but also of research and development, and in some cases quite speculative ideas about how how a certain technology can mitigate already existing climate change, right? So when I talk about green capitalism, it is kind of a mix of productive forces that are already being installed and deployed to produce certain products that at least are justified because they have some role in greening the economy, right? Whether that's a lithium battery or a lower carbon steel. But also, and this is where I think the critical valence is important to retain, unproven technologies, right? Technologies where the firms that make them or the governments that promote them can claim that they will help us solve the climate crisis, and so geoengineering or carbon capture. But I think it's good to think about all of these together, because at the sectoral level, at the investment level, and in the arena of political contention and policymaking, they are in the same sort of group, right? And so, I guess that unlike those kind of other definitions, I focus more on, materially what is happening with capitalism, right? One of, I think, there's like kind of two other elements that you brought in that I think help us specify the current conjuncture of green capitalism. One is this kind of the geopolitical aspect, and the other is like this kind of deeper issue too of capital accumulation and profitability, right? And so I'm going to end up connecting those a bit, but I want to treat them separately to start with, right? And because your question also disambiguated them. So in this moment of escalated geopolitical tensions, that's exactly the moment in which onshoring has become like a favored tactic on the part of states. They have promoted onshoring in part by, as I said, kind of stitching together a coalition that can include climate activists, include like industrial policy advocates, can include national security hawks that are concerned about China, right? And so onshoring is a way to kind of assert geopolitical prowess while also building this green capitalist economy. It is quite, in some ways, auspicious and felicitous for green capitalism, this onshoring argument, because in reality, what it amounts to is tax breaks and subsidies and financial underwriting and backstopping for the operations of green capital. Because once the mining of lithium or the factories of lithium batteries are seen as like geostrategically important, the floodgates of state support open, right? So in this way, the security discourses are, which might be in some ways perhaps, I'll revisit this in a moment, perhaps like circumstantial or unrelated to the inner workings of capitalism, but they can definitely help promote the interests of capitalists, right? And that's why they're in this coalition. I think two questions follow from that you yourself have pointed to. One is, if we onshore all this mining in the global north, does that change our view of the global economy, in which, like, it used to be that mainly extraction comes from peripheries, and, so that's one of your questions. The other one of your questions is it really so copacetic between these multinational corporations with these relatively dispersed supply chains and this kind of security interest in onshoring? Like, is there a limit to how much those two factions can get along, right? Or see themselves as part of a shared political project, right? And so for the first, I think it's very important, and I often have to like doubly or triply emphasize this lest I be mistaken. I am not at all arguing, or let alone like observing, that there is a movement of mining from the global south to the global north. Instead, it's an expansion, right? We can almost stick with that idea of energy addition, or like an all of the above, or like this multiplicity and multiplication of extractive regimes and the multiplication of extractive frontiers, to kind of apprehend the fact that you can have more mining in the global north and more mining in the global south. As long as demand is growing, there is no contradiction there, right? And you can actually potentially develop even more inequalities. I'm not quite sure we see that yet, but we could imagine a situation in which the regulatory regimes governing extraction in the north and south diverge. This is not, I don't fully think this is the case right now, so I want to be clear about that, but just as a thought experiment, right? Like, what if we got much better environmental regulation of mining in the global north than in the global south? Let's just say that were happening. Then not only would we continue with unequal exchange, because there's still mining in the global south, that's still really routed towards global north economies, and plus there's more mining in the global north, but also the global south mining is like even more environmentally harmful. So we're actually like basically increasing the kind of gap of unequal ecological exchange and economic exchange, right? So that's just a thought experiment for now, but because mining is still pretty toxic in the global north too, right? So I don't want to say it's clean in the global north, though that's part of the discourse, right? But it's just to say that you can expand extraction inside the global north without necessarily fundamentally changing south-north relations. However, I do think it has knock-on effects and implications politically, economically, and ecologically to have more mining in the global north, right? It certainly brings the consequences of our supply chains, of our modes of production and consumption a little closer to home, right? Who they actually affect And whether your average consumer or more affluent consumer of some of these products, whether it's a Tesla or a solar panel, really encounters mining, even if it's in the US, that's a separate question. And that, I think, important. And so the last thing I'll say on this point is that for me, what has been very enlightening about grappling with mining for green technologies in the global north is that it's revealed to me how fractal the relationships are of core and periphery, right? That we actually should not be satisfied with a sort of methodological nationalism in which entire countries are labeled one way and other entire countries are labeled another. Because what that obscures is the fact that within the global north, there are hinterlands, there are rural peripheries, there are extractive frontiers that at certain moments state actors have found it strategic to have within their own borders, right? Just the same as in the global south. There's class inequality. There are people that benefit more from that regime of extractivism than the people that pay the ecological price for it, right? So I think that it behooves us to think in terms of scales or in terms of fractal patterns. And the fact that when mining is brought onshore into the US, the people and places it affects are people and places that bear some resemblance to the colonized and then neo-colonized kind of subjects in the global south, meaning they're indigenous peoples, they are people that are, considered more sacrificable because of their rural kind of land-based or place-based kind of livelihoods. They are, there's a lot of ecological sacrifice, right? And so it can kind of show us across the global divide of north and south these kind of resonances and echoes, right? Without flattening the world into some kind of flat space, right? The second thing I want to get to, and this will kind of wrap my thoughts on this matter, is how much can the national security hawkishness and the anti-China and the supply chain security stuff that motivates this onshoring, how much can that stay in a kind of happy alliance with ultimately transnational capital, right? And there's a lot of benefits slushing around that kind of enable that alliance, as I said, the kind of fact that in reality, this is a very corporate-friendly set of policies, because the way you attract capitalists to do things is by, financial sweeteners and carrots more than sticks and whatever, right? So, that helps soften any potential tensions, but the tensions are still there. And I maybe want to bring in something that I don't have a firm opinion on, but I think it would be interesting for viewers to kind of think about a little bit, which is why are we in such a moment of geoeconomics, of a moment where economic policies and economic processes are being seen through the lens of national security, where a decade ago it was fine to just get copper on global markets and import it from Chile, no problem. We pay a cheap price, it's pretty reliable. And now it's maybe we need that copper in the US. Why are we in a moment where it seems like capitalism is being reshaped according to geopolitical directives? And that, I think, entails a deeper question that can implicate capitalism itself, right? So I think there's a way in which I initially sketched them where these are almost external facts to one another, right? On the one hand, you have these state actors who are geopolitically driven. On the other hand, you have transnational capital or globalist capital that might like benefiting from those security policies, but ultimately would also prefer to maintain global supply chains and the ability to partner with countries around the world or investors around the world, right? But, some interesting thinkers, I'm thinking of Jamie Merchant, Jack Copley, some interesting Ialis Amani, correct me if I'm saying anyone's name wrong, have gotten to this kind of understanding where the geopolitics are themselves a result of a contradiction in capitalism, right? So that kind of, rather than an external contradiction, it's an immanent contradiction within capitalism, right? I'm not saying if I fully subscribe to this argument, but I find it very thought-provoking. And the basics are that capital globally has been entering into, over the past decades, a situation of terminal secular stagnation, due to problems of overcapacity, right? They're drawing a lot on Robert Brenner's work, et cetera.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a little difficulty with how you fully assimilate China into this narrative. They have ways of assimilating China, but it obviously goes against the grain of secular stagnation since it boomed and rose during the period of most pronounced secular stagnation in the West. But we'll put that aside, and I know and I acknowledge that there's ways to kind of incorporate China into this narrative as well. But regardless, in a case in which capitalists themselves begin to see limits to profitability, what in the 70s, in the famous title, were called limits to growth, right? In terms of the ecological, limits, right? Limits because of this secular decline in which there's a shrinking pie, or at least a more static pie, that capitals, we can get into the idea of national capitals, are kind of competing over what is a kind of stagnating amount of total profitability and kind of opportunities. In such
zero-sum game.
Exactly. I was just literally about to say that. In such a zero-sum domain, game theory tells us that actors start to behave differently, right? The constraints become more intense. You start to use tactics that are alive to those constraints rather than assuming infinite growth, right? And so part of what's emerging in this moment is that states are enabling capital accumulation by subsidizing it, and also by kind of buttressing in a mercantilist vein the competition, the antagonistic competition between capitals headquartered in different great powers with one another, right? And so in a way, what all this neo-mercantilism, this protectionism, this geoeconomics speaks to is kind of increasingly apparent constraints on capital accumulation itself. In which case, sure, there might be fights between different political actors, between the most hawkish versions of this coalition, or kind of elements of this coalition, and the most transnational capital-aligned elements of this coalition. But at the end of the day, from this perspective, they actually issue from the same, set of contradictions in capitalism itself, right? So that's a way to kind of view them as connected rather than externally in confrontation. However, I think that, we're all political actors, meaning, that it is a theory that is compelling, but on the day-to-day of politics and of political fights, political antagonisms, the terrain of politics, the terrain of the state, these elements do enter into tension with one another, right? And so I think it's important on the left to not totally smooth that out, and to instead think about, whether we're thinking just intellectually from the perspective of critique, or politically from the perspective of action and intervention and protagonism. Are those tensions, even if, again, this orientation of a kind of geoeconomic capitalism issues from this kind of shared dilemma, there are tensions between different state and capital actors of how to deal with that fact, and those tensions can give us critical analytic leverage on the system writ large, and they can also potentially orient us to political openings, right? Because I think, especially in a moment in many countries in the so-called West of political marginalization of the left or some political defeat, one of the openings that we have to look for is fractures and fragmentation among elite actors. That might be a precondition for us to situate ourselves so that we can gain some political protagonism in this moment, right? So I think there's a strategic reason on the left to not erase or flatten or explain away some of the tensions that are clearly there, at least on the level of kind of daily politics. And maybe, one last thing I want to say is that, to kind of maybe tie a bow on this a little bit, is that if, according to some of the scholars that I've named, this whole geoeconomic turn and onshoring as a specific tactic of that, if that itself issues from a crisis of profitability of capitalism, then there's a question, which is it solving that crisis? Mm. And that is a very open question, which I think actually redounds to, or sort of underscores the utility of that analysis of crisis of profitability. Because if the crisis is as deep as some of those thinkers that I said say, then it's actually maybe not surprising that these geoeconomic strategies are not fully solving it, or they're a temporary Band-Aid, or they're a provisional settlement, rather than fully solving the crisis, right? And, there's just so many examples of that, and Brett Christopher's work is among that, has alerted me to this quite a bit, but, and as well as the work of some others, that not only, there's this kind of broader issue of capital accumulation, but specifically actually in green sectors, whether those are renewable electricity markets or some of the mining sectors associated with these supply chains, or solar panels, or green steel, right? All of these have faced some pretty fundamental profitability questions, precisely and especially in the sort of Western polities that are trying to prop them up through these neo-mercantilist protectionist means. But, after quite a bit of financial backstopping on the part of the EU, Northvolt the Swedish battery maker is bankrupt, right? And so, and then what's amazing, and I just want to end it here, the news just in the news today, on the day that we're recording this, is that bankruptcy, but also the EU deciding to get more stringent about investment policies and foreign direct investment, which is specifically aimed at China. So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, the vaunted European experiment in battery self-sufficiency, right, and sort of self-powered, pun intended, kind of green economy, with tremendous financial underwriting by the EU and by European companies as purchasers initially, like BMW, and them pulling out was part of what created this crisis, among other things, right? The failure and the bankruptcy, literally and figuratively, of that kind of project is then side by side by, instead of the EU, for example, saying, well, okay, our bid to have a Swedish battery and a kind of European supply chain didn't totally work. Let's just go back to Chinese investment, to joint ventures with Chinese and South Korean companies, which already provision 60% of European batteries, right? So that route seems better. Maybe we should do tech transfer. Maybe we should invite more of this FDI under our own terms, sure, but not shy away from it or not prohibit it. And instead, we have the opposite, which is a doubling down on securitized rules of investment, in which case there are serious questions raised about how we're going to get a green economy in Europe, because apparently it's not Northvolt, nor is it BYD, right? Under at least in terms of what politicians are currently orienting towards. And that raises not only questions about industrial policy and political economy, but questions about decarbonizing Europe, which is supposedly what initially was driving all of this, right? And so we see how security and sustainability, they can be joined as a powerful discursive and policy apparatus, but they can also enter into real tension with one another.
Especially also because most recently in Europe, in the German weapons producer Rheinmetall just announced that they would be able to take over the idle capacity of Volkswagen. So
fascinating.
Instead of decarbonizing or reducing car dependency, or growing the EV park of Europe, we might see a sort of war Keynesianism fueled by
100%. Yeah. Which is, and the road to that was partly paved with these green discourses of onshoring and supply chains. And it's very interesting to think through how easily that gets militarized, or how easily this stuff gets redirected towards, oh, it's actually a military goal now, or a security goal, or a rearmament goal, rather than a climate goal. But it's the same policies. And we see the policies can really serve quite different ends. And that raises a question of whether some of us, maybe not me, but people who I respect and worked with, were a little too sanguine about the conjoining of security discourses and sustainability discourses. Or, yeah. I mean, at the very least, we need to be alert at which of those forces is going to win out when there is a tension between them.
Okay, I think at this point of the discussion, it might actually be a good moment to broaden the historical scope of what you just have introduced as geoeconomics, since in your book you suggest a periodization of these very geoeconomics. So you trace a trajectory from the 1970s energy crisis that you've just mentioned, when third world resource nationalism had peaked and global north energy security strategies took shape, to Biden's push for green industrial dominance, which institutionalizes supply chain security through onshoring and demanufacturing incentives. So could you maybe walk us through these four key moments that you identify in your periodization? So the 70s energy crisis, the 2008 financial crisis and the commodity boom, Trump's geoeconomic turn in 2016, and finally Biden's green industrial push in 2020. So in what ways do these moments reveal continuities and ruptures in geoeconomic strategy?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's actually in a way causing me to rethink some things, the way that you've posed it. The scholars that I borrow the term geoeconomics from, it's not my own coinage at all, have a more stadial or stagist kind of understanding of recent economic history, in which neoliberalism was predominant or hegemonic from, let's say, the 70s through the 2010s. And then at a certain moment, and we could split hairs about when it happened, but geoeconomics becomes the prevailing kind of discourse and policy approach, prevailing kind of thought world, even more broadly, of powerful actors in the current global economy, right? So first neoliberalism, then geoeconomics, right? And the way in which neoliberalism and geoeconomics are distinct from one another is clear enough if we have very how shall I say it, like very pure versions, ideal type, that's the word I'm looking for, ideal typical understandings of a neoliberal world order of like free trade and capital mobility. And not that states aren't there, but their main goal is to facilitate the movement and accumulation of capital, right? Or to protect property vis-a-vis other social demands, right? In Quinn Slobodian's rendering, to kind of protect markets from democracy, right? So the state can be quite muscular, but the state is oriented to facilitating capital, right? Whereas in a geoeconomic order, there's this deep imbrication of security, strategic, geostrategic imperatives of the state that are kind of viewed as somewhat external to the operations of capital. Those get kind of imbricated, and the state starts shaping capital accumulation and movement, or lack thereof, trying to maybe stop so much movement of capital and keep it within your borders, right? According to geoeconomic imperatives, right? Or geopolitical imperatives, we can say, right? So there's this stagist idea. What I want to actually argue, and your question is prompting me to argue this, maybe clarifying it to me for the first time, is that I'm not totally satisfied with that stagism. I think it ignores some of the really prevalent security discourses and policies in the period of high neoliberalism, just as it might encourage us too much to kind of discard with neoliberalism in the present as a concept that's still relevant, might maybe trick us into like we're in a totally post-neoliberal moment, right? So on either side of this divide, I think there's a lot more threads and continuities, right, than a stadial understanding would maybe suggest. And so when we go to what's often taken as the proximate origin point for what we call neoliberalism, and we often trace that to the 70s. Of course, there's an intra-war, there's an earlier history of even the term neoliberalism. I'll leave that to the historians, right? But in the 70s is when, we see major implementation of policies that we tend to call neoliberalism. And we actually see them across the global South and North. In fact, of course, Chile is a key laboratory for this, as is, the Eastern Bloc or whatever, right? And then, of course, Thatcher and Reagan, and I don't need to walk us through all of this, but in the 80s, picking up in the 80s. But the 70s, has another association with it, which is the energy crisis, right? And so at the same time that we're seeing the beginnings of what we now call neoliberal policies and neoliberal hegemony, we're also in a moment of profound crisis in the very materiality of the capitalist economy, which is the flows of oil, which are the lifeblood. I take that from Matt Huber, the lifeblood of the global system, right? And so it's a moment in which, as you put it yourself, where we have basically a battle over the kind of who gets to control and who gets to benefit from and who pays the cost of the kind of global resource economy, with oil being at its center. But there were also battles over mining and other related extractive sectors as well at the same time. And what we saw was a kind of empowerment and kind of confidence and assertiveness of global South, what we would call third world at the time and non-aligned at the time, right? Governments, and this took the form of OPEC, this took the form of nationalizations, right? A real assertiveness, which was met, not unsurprisingly, like with a real backlash from the global North, but not just a backlash in the form of military coups or attempting to kind of undercut these resource nationalist experiments, but also, as we discussed earlier, in terms of, well, let's build some of our own internal resource security, right? So then we get the expanding extractive or fossil frontier, within the global North, right? So that 70s moment is so pivotal, not just because it's like, just, another moment where we see these contests over global resources and extraction, but it literally like birthed the logics and the languages of dependency, understood as a critical concept on the part of the third world. Like, we want to get away from the trap of dependency. That means we need sovereignty, we need assertiveness, we need nationalization, and then dependency with a very different valence on the global North side, right? So I think that it's, it's the intimate entanglement of colonizer and colonized. You can even see that in the word choices, right? And so dependency for the global North wasn't, we're dependent to the dictates of other capitalists elsewhere, of governments elsewhere, but that we depend on our former colonies for their resources, right? We actually fundamentally depend on them. And once that spigot is cut off, or it's rechanneled, or the terms of access are increased, the barriers to our access, then we start to get worried, right? And then we start to talk about, early versions of onshoring and securitization and things like this, right? So the 70s create a legacy that, is kind of, in certain ways, providing some of the concepts and analyses that are relevant again in our moment, right? Each of these moments, and I won't go through them in the same detail, but in 2008, you had another real reckoning for the way that extraction took place, because we had a commodity boom that was really driven by China's industrialization as well as by the other emerging economies. And so the prices of copper, soy, beef, everything, oil went through the roof. And that really scared, I won't curse on this video, but I was going to say scared the shit out of, but scared very much so, like the global north policymakers who were like, we can't rely on this cheap copper, beef, and soil. And not only are the prices high for imports that are important to us, but also they're high because there's an ascendant other economic power, which is China. Yeah. Not only is China ascendant, but we're in our worst financial crisis ever, which is itself not unrelated to China's ascendancy, because one reason among many for China's concerted industrial policy was actually seeing the West in shambles, the financial system in shambles, and saying, okay, we got to kind of do this ourselves, right? And so on both sides of the sort of Western China divide, the financial crisis and the commodity boom were key reasons, for this turn towards like, okay, we need secure supply chains. Now, in China, that proceeded apace, and they have continued to securitize their supply chains quite successfully, you might say. In the West, there wasn't quite the political opening for it yet. Yeah. Like the ideas of secure supply chains and critical minerals and like we need to onshore this date to that crisis moment, but they didn't have their political opening until the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a variety of geopolitical conflagrations, which provided political opening. And the other thing that gave political opening too for these ideas of industrial policy and supply chain security and all of that was the right-wing populist backlash represented by Trump, right, which spoke about bringing manufacturing back home. And then what's the liberal response to that? The liberal response is to actually orient towards that, is to mutate towards that, is to not say, no, let's defend free trade. Like that's actually, interestingly, not the liberal response. They realize that there is no longer quite that political constituency for like a free trade globalization, and for various reasons that I'll leave it to your other interview subjects to get into. But it's a clear, reckoning moment for liberals, and the way that they deal with this is by, and this speaks to almost where our last question ended, but is by kind of preserving some of this economic nationalism, ratifying it is what I mean to say. The economic nationalism, the supply chain security, a lot of the specific dictates of that Trump, the first Trump government, and green it, or like, and high tech it, and sort of make it less about just this like brash, like we're gonna bring stuff home, and say, in order to fulfill our green objectives, in order to have the best semiconductor industry, in order to be at the scientific vanguard or the vanguard of even like human progress. I mean, you get these really big statements by liberals, we need supply chain security. But the kind of way that you securitize supply chains are like show the legacy of the 70s, show this continuity from Trump to Biden, right? And so you see these and have also these ideas that were first formulated during the commodity boom. So I don't want to downplay, ruptures and real changes. At each of these are ruptures, but what happens on the other side of the rupture is not like a black and white change. It is the kind of reconfiguration of elements and policy elements and discursive elements from the prior kind of regime, their reconfiguration to new ends. And so we see a kind of layered, sedimented process of historical change in which things are escalating, but they're escalating based on foundations and plateaus that are kind of like consolidated and sedimented at each prior moment. And so I think it just gives us a more sense of historical logic to these developments, and they're less kind of out of the blue.
And the architect or the main protagonist of the Biden security endorsement was probably Jake Sullivan, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, right. And so, we have these kind of actors that are at the border between security policy and economic policy, and themselves blurring that border. I want to just say one other quick thing here, because my answer there was quite global north centric, aside from the mention of China, which is just that what we also see today is a return, and it's not always the best term, but I don't want to history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but like we see some kind of renewed interest in resource nationalism in the global south. And these, again, are related to one another, right? We see kind of just overall kind of like politicization of these supply chains, which is kind of making salient again strategies that, as I said, kind of first gelled in the 1970s.
All right, with my next question, I'd like to go back to the question of green extraction. So you're a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and in that role you co-authored a recent report which is titled More Mobility, Less Mining, which explores different decarbonization scenarios. So the report finds that lithium demand could actually be reduced by up to 92% in 2050 compared to the most lithium-intensive projections. And doing this primarily by reducing car dependency, right-sizing EV batteries, and establishing a strong recycling system. Also, you've described yourself as agnostic on one of the key divides within the climate left, so between eco-modernism and degrowth. So I wonder how does this report navigate the tension between, on the one hand, criticizing extraction and on the other hand, advocating for maybe more controlled approach to it. So to put it polemically, do you think there's a sort of eco-socialist model of extraction that is possible?
Yeah, thanks. I like the polemical question. So I think that there's a couple of ways that I would analyze this debate about eco-modernism and degrowth, or I won't not analyze the debate, but sort of my position in it or outside of it, or as the case may be. I think on the one hand, to some degree, the wrong questions are being asked. And one of the questions that tends to be asked by these two different camps, especially about what I work on, which is this energy transition related extraction, is like, is there enough, right? And so it's a question of like sort of planetary boundaries or underlying resources. And the strong eco-modernist view is that the possibilities are limitless. Whether that's because there's a sense that, we keep discovering more resources, more deposits, I mean, or whether that's because of a belief in decoupling, whether absolute or relative, meaning that you can sort of decouple growth from its ecological requirements or from, its ecological impacts or its climate emissions, right? So through efficiencies of production, through technological innovation, you actually reduce the impacts of capitalism, right? That's another way in which eco-modernism is optimistic about the kind of resource question. We'll just need less per unit over time because we'll innovate our way out of this question. Degrowth is way less sanguine. It's much more pessimistic about whether the planet can actually support this level of growth that's currently or forecast, right? And sometimes, not always, and so I want to be clear here because there are degrowth analyses that are very similar to mine and some that are less similar to mine, right? And so what I actually say I'm agnostic on is not per se my position in this debate. I think I'm closer to the degrowth side, but whether degrowth is the right kind of concept or term. And the reason is because I think, there's sort of different versions of degrowth, but there is a version that has been prominent where the claim is a strong one about kind of relatively static or written in stone, as it were, planetary boundaries, and that there simply are not enough resources to sustain a sort of Western mode of lifestyle or production or consumption, especially if that's kind of universalized around the planet, right? And so, when I say they ask the wrong question, I think the question of like, is there enough, is actually not really ever what governs what happens with extraction, nor is it what is most concerning about extraction. So from the degrowth perspective, like, it's less that I'm worried that we're going to run out of lithium, which we're not about to anytime soon. And it's more that I'm worried about the mounting ecological toll of extracting it. And so I think that view can align with degrowth, but it's maybe sometimes issues from a slightly different concern. But maybe also to push and to stay with the polemics. I think that to different degrees, degrowth scholars and activists have an answer or don't to the question of, well, how do we extract under eco-socialism or in a utopian degrowth, commune that we live in, right? Like, if we could implement degrowth, if we could, and in its most progressive and left-wing version, where we're attentive to class, we're attentive to geographic differences, right? Where we're not saying that we should impose austerity on Bolivia. Like we're saying, no, the austerity is actually just for the ruling classes and the global north, like they should consume less. Like I think there are versions of degrowth that are so similar to my politics because they're very attuned to class differences in consumption or geographic differences in consumption, right? But you know, even with that nuance that I think the best versions of degrowth bring to the table, which is like not like this universal austerity for everybody, we still have this question of like, if we implemented an eco-socialist society, which had things like free and frequent and reliable electric buses that served working class communities and got them around and created no tailpipe emissions and were just lovely kind of like specimens of communal luxury, right? Like that kind of world, where do the batteries come from? Like who makes them and where does the lithium come from, right? Like these are questions that I think the best degrowth scholars do answer, but not always everyone in degrowth, right? And because there is an almost uncomfortability or a sort of lack of comfort, I don't know if that's a word, a lack of comfort with dealing with this fundamental fact of extraction. And so, you know, I think what I press on my comrades, I'll put it that way, like, because in a political kind of sense, like, and people that I've organized with, campaigned with, done all this, is like, how do we deal with the fact that even under eco-socialism, there is a metabolism with nature, and that some of that metabolism with nature involves the appropriation of non-renewable resources, right? Because there's one kind of metabolic version where you're kind of in a constantly renewing, right? But if we look at things like lithium or any minerals or metals, like they are not renewable on human timescales. So is there a way that we're like, you know, how do we extract those so that we can make the e-buses, but without falling into the worst pitfalls? And I think that of the harms of extraction and the inequalities of it. And I think, you know, one thing that I want to say, which your question points us to, is that I think it's important to keep conceptual daylight between extractivism as this like kind of brutal, violent, extractive modality of capitalism in the world's peripheries, whether those peripheries are in the global south or internal to the global north, right? That extractivism as a system, from extraction as an economic activity that we can, I think, imagine under a fundamentally different economic system, governed by totally different imperatives, whether those are imperatives of planning, democratic planning, eco-social planning, whether those are kind of parameters of worker ownership or community ownership, whether the idea is that the people who extract should benefit from the extraction. So those e-buses are not only also made near the mine site, but the communities around the factory and the mine also ride the e-buses and maybe own the e-bus, you know, or maybe it's a public company, right? I mean, this thought experiment is just to point us to the fact that once we start teasing out the distinction between extraction like simpliciter and extractivism as a certain way that extraction has taken place for half a millennia under capitalism, I think we can get pretty granular and think of some quite interesting possibilities of how extraction could be quite different under eco-socialism, including, perhaps most importantly, that there could be a lot less of it. Not none of it in the near term, because we need to build the e-buses, right? They don't exist, there are not enough of them yet. But over time, it can become more circular, but at the very least, without this privatized and unequal consumption patterns, we could extract much less. And I think that should be itself a goal of eco-socialist extraction, is to minimize its size in the economy or in the social framework in which it occurs.
All right. Before we conclude, I'd like to turn to the present moment following Donald Trump's re-election. So many have argued that outright climate crisis denial has evolved, so either into far-right ecological narratives, sometimes called eco-fascism, or into capitalist decarbonization strategies that we've just talked about. So Adrian Buller, for example, has identified a palpable shift towards these tendencies. Yet Trump's revival of the "Drill Baby Drill" slogan during his inauguration in January challenges this assumption. His appointment of Chris Wright, a former oil executive and vocal climate denialist, as energy secretary signals a renewed push for aggressive fossil fuel expansion. Andreas Malm and Will Carden have recently described this as the era of fossil overshoot, so the era where ruling classes openly accept the failure of the 1.5-degree target set by the Paris Agreement and instead emphasize carbon removal technologies. But Trump's energy policies also appear deeply contradictory. On one hand, promoting domestic mining of battery materials to position the US as the world's top lithium producer, while on the other undermining EV and wind industries. So he has declared an energy emergency while simultaneously aiming to double the exports of liquefied natural gas by 2028. So I'm wondering if these are simply incoherent gestures, or if you would agree with Robinson Mayer, for example, that there's a broader rational, a broader effort to maximize fossil fuel markets.
Yeah, I think both. I think they're incoherent, and there is a real resurgent, a muscular, almost bellicose kind of resurgence of fossil capitalism. And it never went away. You know, we had a moment a few years ago, and maybe we'll get to this a little at the sort of very end, where there was a real question of like, wow, we might actually really pivot from fossil capital to this kind of green capitalism. I think, but what ended up happening was not a pivot, was this kind of energy addition piece, right? And so, but it's not just like a smooth addition. It's involving the real reassertion of domination by fossil capital, right? And holding on to its position economically and politically, right? And so that in the figure of Trump, in the figure of his government, we see this real reassertion of the kind of strong arm of fossil capital, both in its ability to shape government and advance its priorities, and in its literal profitability, which is quite dramatic and quite impressive compared to especially the green sectors, right? And so it's renewed its profitability, it's really it's renewed its hold on politics, it's reasserted. And so, yes, I agree with this maximization of fossil fuels, but there are incoherences, which, you know, you've named a couple of, but you mentioned the, wanting to boost domestic consumption, but also wanting to boost exports, which actually require sort of different policies to do each of those. But there's also, even on a more basic level, perhaps, like the desire for really cheap oil and cheap gas, but also the desire to keep the fossil fat cats happy with high prices and profitability. Like, fossil fuel executives don't want low prices. I mean, obviously, and so, you know, there's real tensions there, and there's also the fact that, like, from the finance or investment perspective, a low price environment doesn't do what Trump wants, which is a massive expansion in extractive capacity, right? Because if prices are low, you know, your profit margins are thinner, and you're not going to attract as much investment, and so you can't simultaneously have cheap oil and super profitable oil, or like a lot of domestic consumption and a lot of export. I mean, it's hard to square all these things, but you can definitely see that he and his cabinet are promoting like different aspects of fossil dominance simultaneously, but that there are tensions, right? One aspect of fossil dominance is mass consumption of fossil fuels, which cheapness helps. Another is like profitability and the political power that issues from that profitability, which is in tension with the cheapness, right? But these are different facets of fossil capital's power, and we can see internal contradictions there, which in a way are actually just reflected in the internal contradictions of Trump's policies.
And Trump has also announced plans to shift funds away from the EV incentives and instead prioritize securing China-free battery supply chains. As you have pointed out, and so it's basically about emphasizing more lithium mining but less electric mobility. And so there's an approach that merges America First security policy with elements of climate denialism, reshaping the state's role in resource extraction and industrial policy. So I wonder how this sort of mineral endorsement of Trump fits into your framework of the security sustainability nexus.
Yeah, well, the Trump government in 2016 is the government under which we got the beginnings of this security sustainability nexus, right? And it might sound a little weird to say that because Trump doesn't talk about sustainability very much. However, he laid the groundwork through primarily executive orders, but also some discourses that his cabinet members started to articulate as well, for this, like, we need to bring mining back to the US type of thing, right? And especially critical minerals, right? We're really focused on these minerals that have this kind of almost dual use, like they're economically important, they're also important to the new energy sectors, but they also have security implications from the state's perspective, right? So he really promoted this expansion of domestic mining. And interestingly, when you get into the kind of, on a discursive front, some of the genealogy here, some of his own cabinet members, not the super top ones, but some important ones in the relevant agencies, articulated sustainability reasons for this. They said, we don't know what happens in this offshore mining, these dirty, exotic places in the world. We're going to make it cleaner and make it American. Like they actually use, and there are right wing, and I know that, some of our colleagues that study ecology on the right, there are certain ecological discourses on the right, or sometimes they're bad faith and they're just for justification. Sometimes they have this blood and soil conservation. I mean, there's a whole, range out there. But, and the Zetkin Collective, of course, focuses a lot on that. But what I'm saying is that, the political origins of this onshoring shift, approximately, not going all the way back to the 70s, are under the Trump government, right? So, and then the Biden government more explicitly layers on the kind of added energy transition goals and climate goals as well. But, I think part of what this all reveals is just, again, how malleable, how politically capacious and how useful the category of critical minerals is. Critical minerals, right? They're critical for security, for climate, for the economy, for supply chains, whatever. And like in the definition is built in these ambiguities and these different interpretive possibilities, right? And so if in 2016 and today, under the Trump government, there's been a major focus on critical minerals, but in primarily a security vein, in the first government, his first administration, sometimes a little bit of, oddly enough, sustainability justification. Today, the sustainability stuff has quite fallen out, but the security stuff is very emphasized, which again shows that internal kind of dynamic between security and sustainability, and security is going to tend to win out when there's any tension point between the two. And so Trump is very comfortable promoting much more resource extraction in the US, which is really core to his political coalition, fossil capital, but also mining capital, right? And he's very comfortable with this, with disconnecting it from the green goals and with doubling down on the security goals and the kind of antagonistic geopolitical goals, right? And so, there's so much to say here, but I'll just say one thing, which is, again, like thinking through our own politics on the left and like, are there ways to strategically use the security discourses to further our goals? Or does that always feed the return of actors such as Trump? Like, does it just feed militarism and bellicosity to kind of frame climate as a security issue and therefore frame lithium mining and these supply chains as good for national security? Or can we savvily kind of use those discourses while not falling into the obvious pitfalls of the fundamental, like, actual asymmetry between state security and the state's commitment to sustainability, right? So I think it raises questions for us going forward, us, the left, I mean, just speak broadly. But I think that it shows a lot about the through lines from Trump to Biden and to Trump currently.
Before you wrap up, I'd like to discuss Trump's policies toward both Greenland and Ukraine. So the former is, as we now know, is a territory which is abundant in both critical minerals but also in oil. So it's sort of a key symbol of what we've just analyzed in terms of a sort of green-brown synthesis, like both green and fossil in contemporary capitalism. Following the recent critical minerals deal between the US and Ukraine, you published an article in the Financial Times highlighting how such agreements are part of a broader global trend. So last year, the EU signed a similar deal with Rwanda, while the government of the DR Congo has proposed a critical minerals agreement with the US, which was modeled on the Ukraine deal. So how do you explain this growing trend? And specifically in the case of Ukraine, what makes its critical minerals so strategically important?
Yeah, it's great because I think we see a couple of different patterns and developments coming together and also clashing a little bit in the developments that you just laid out, or in the current events kind of that you just laid out. One is a maybe provocative but hopefully interesting claim I want to make, which is that despite appearances, there is a real through line between onshoring, which, as I just said, took form under Trump 1 and Biden's government, this critical minerals and overall supply chain onshoring, between onshoring and threatening sovereign countries, bullying them, threatening or bullying them, soft and hard power, to like gain access to their critical minerals, right? So we've seen this in Greenland, in Ukraine, in Canada, in divergent ways, right? Because sometimes it's a threat to invade, other times it's let's make a deal. But regardless, you are going after the deposits of sovereign nations that are outside of your territorial borders. So it almost seems like the opposite of onshoring. Onshoring is bringing in, this is a kind of more outward and obviously harkens back to a classical form of imperialism, right? But I think that there's a through line, and I think that sometimes it's Trump saying the quiet part out loud. So what I mean by that is, the Biden government, the State Department under the Biden government, actually was pressuring Greenland quite a bit to ensure that its mineral deposits went towards the West or U.S. corporations and not China. And they were actually kind of partly successful in that lobbying, including like changing a particular transaction so that a deposit was sold to a Western company and not to a Chinese one, right? So some of it is, but we didn't know about it. I mean, meaning literally, like there wasn't really reporting on this so much at the time. It's like after the fact, I, as a sort of expert on this, had learned that what Trump is doing super bellicose, super intensely with threats of invasion were done more quietly, maybe even more savvily by the Biden government, right? So I think that's one important thing to note, one important way that we can see the continuity. But another is that, there are two ways to onshore. We usually think of the first way, which is bring stuff within the borders. A second way, that again goes back to that classical imperial mode, is expand the borders. So your borders now encompass Greenland, or your borders now encompass Canada. We annex, right? And that annexation, classical mode of imperialism, and what does that do? It makes the borders of the state larger because the jurisdiction of the imperial capital or the imperial core now has more territory underneath it, right? And so I think that like it's a slippery slope with onshoring, and I don't want to impugn all ideas about supply chain diversification or changing the location of supply chains. I'm not against that, and I'm absolutely not some proponent of like free trade, whatever that might mean, right? But it is to say that once you start talking about privileged access to resources, that your corporations or your state agencies get to have this type of access, and one way to do it is have it nearby, and another is to say we're taking over the country where it happens. And so I think that there is, or we're bullying a war-torn country like Ukraine into handing over mineral wealth. And so I think that that is an uncomfortable thing to maybe think about for proponents of onshoring who are dead set against what Trump is doing. But there's a logical thread there that I think is important. The just final thing I want to say, because it's important to note, especially for those who don't work on resource sectors and maybe don't know what I'm about to say, which is I think what Ukraine and Greenland also reveal is just how deeply speculative resource political economies are. And not just in the financial sense, but that too, very much that too, but also just in the sense of what is actually underground and how do we get at it, and like how big is that reserve and how feasible and economically viable is it to extract? There's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of probabilistic statements, okay, a 90% proven reserve, this type of thing. I like Brett Christopher's term for this, that deposits are actually not just some kind of scientific category. They are narrations of the future, he calls them. Narrations of, we're pretty sure that this deposit will yield this amount of minerals and therefore yield this amount of profits, which helps us get the investment. That's why we need the narration of the future, is to attract investors. So there's really a dense, multi-layered speculative aspect to resource political economies. And I say that with Greenland and Ukraine because their resources are undeveloped. Like, we don't actually know like how easy it will be, how much there is. Some of this stuff in Ukraine relies on Soviet era surveying that has not been updated more recently. Greenland, we've known these deposits, they've known these deposits, but very few projects have proceeded for a variety of reasons, including in some cases local opposition. So it's not at all clear that there's like an easy to trigger like resource abundant economy in either of these places. There's a lot of crucibles that will need to be passed through in order for these resources to really be developed. But, with a stroke of a pen or with just an infographic or a map, put up beside him, Trump and his government can just say, lots of resources there, let's get them. Themselves almost oddly enough playing into the speculative narration of the future, right? Which, it shows how such governmental pronouncements might actually be key to future financing. But it's not because we actually know with verified kind of certainty that these resources are easy to access or exactly what their quantities are.
especially in case of Ukraine, where we rely on Soviet surveys.
Absolutely. Right? And where, again, the non-insignificant deposits, a number of these deposits are actually in currently Russian-controlled areas, which is then not unrelated to Putin saying, I'll cut you a better deal. We'll get you Russia's minerals, like to Trump, and the ones that we control in the Ukraine territory that we control, right? So we also see how these speculative narrations of the future can actually get imbricated with escalatory geopolitical tactics, right? And can be it's quite felicitous that there's speculation because you can make a move because no one really knows.
All right, for my last question, I would like to go back to the collective that you've just mentioned before, the Zetkin Collective, which proposes to theorize the scenario of fossil fascism, which is defined as the alliance between fossil capital and the nihilist far right, emerging in response to climate policies and the threat of stranded assets. So would you characterize Trump's administration as the nihilist in the strict sense? Or does it instead represent a form of carbon cynicism, meaning acknowledging climate realities while doubling down on fossil fuel expansion for political and economic gain?
Yeah, this is a very important question right now that picks up on some of the preamble to kind of this whole topic in this interview about, how to evaluate climate politics in this moment. I'll just put it that way, right? And I myself have actually moved back and forth on this question, so I'll just be transparent about that back and forth movement, which more or less tracks the back and forthness of the reality, right? But still, we want to get analytic leverage and maybe take sometimes some distance to that volatility, but it's hard to escape it right now. So what I'm referring to more concretely is that there was obviously a long era in which it was absolutely clear that not only was the right wing in full climate denial mode, not only, of course, was fossil capital in full climate denial, and the word denial is important because denial is not lack of knowledge. It is knowledge that you repress, cover up, censor, right? And so denial was never about like, oh, we just don't think it has this effect. It's like, we know that emissions have this effect, or we know that fossil fuels produce emissions that have this effect, and we are denying it, right? Which is very important. The Exxon New kind of campaign and uncovering of how deeply aware Exxon was by its own actually uncannily accurate predictions about global warming and about the effects of fossil fuel-based emissions on the atmosphere. So anyway, there was this denial period. That seemed to give way. We could roughly periodize this, and I draw very much on Malm and Carton's work here, which I've been reading. We can roughly periodize this in the sort of 2018, maybe 2015 to 2021 or 2 kind of moment, where for a variety of reasons, which I will not catalog, but I want to name briefly, schematically, which are everything from Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, Sunrise Movement, these really fairly active youth movements around climate, to kind of some important technological developments where we had cheaper solar panels and batteries and it seemed more viable to kind of build a green economy, to also the escalating geopolitics, and partly for that reason, Western states taking more interest in like beating China at the kind of climate tech game, right? And also, during the pandemic, to like a moment where we also saw like really reduced fossil fuel use, right? Because we weren't commuting and traveling as much, and so the emissions went down. So it also seemed like a moment to take advantage of. Like we can sort of see what a greener economy might look like today, that type of thing. So there were a bunch of different reference points to this conjuncture, but the point is there seemed to be finally a confrontation, even in like the liberal establishment, but definitely on the left and among activists, with the realities of fossil capitalism, of real, like, we can no longer deny, it's so clear what is happening with the climate crisis. It's not something that we are just talking about in low-lying islands, like it's coming into the global north, terrible summers in Europe, right, that killed people, like just heat waves and flooding and all of this type of stuff. So we got to a moment in that 2018 to 2021 or so, the height of it, period, where it seemed like we had moved from like denial to this kind of re-articulation of the climate crisis as an investment opportunity, right? That's where we get this green capitalism takeoff in the way I've defined green capitalism, right? And state and green industrial policy in the global north, also, of course, in the global south, so I don't want to ignore that, right? And it almost feels like we're in a counter-revolutionary moment to that or something, like there was, because it feels like denial is back. It also feels like the right wing was alert to some of the transformative possibilities of massive green public investment. Like it was just too close to the Green New Deal. Even though we never won the Green New Deal, it like suggested the possibility of states intervening to do welfare promoting and like, public investment promoting kind of, interventions. And the right wing like has there are implications of that are completely opposed to their interests, right? And so like, it actually, and it goes back to what I was saying about denial, like denial was never about like a lack of knowledge of climate harm. It was about a knowledge that needed to be repressed because the knowledge of climate harm could inspire public action that stranded the assets of fossil fuel companies. So like it was a real fear that if the knowledge of the climate crisis gets out there, public policies and social movements and the whole kind of political system is going to do things that would be bad for the interests of fossil capital, right? So we see a kind of return of that fear combined with, and I think the carbon cynicism has something to it, combined with a real awareness that like we're screwed. Like, I mean, the planet is in severe crisis, and like the best the ruling class can do for itself is like wall itself, is like get the profits while they're good, get some inheritance to their grandkids, build walls, and make sure that they are able, and I mean walls in all senses, like border walls, sea walls to their fancy apartment buildings and mansions, right? And like protect themselves from the reality that they're aware of, while they simultaneously buttress their profits and their benefits from fossil capital, while they also strongly argue against like this prior turn towards publicly investing to create a green economy, right? And so they're mixing, it's a kind of mix of different strategies, but they all redound to like eking out what you can of fossil capital while like, we can still sort of do that, protecting your interests in the crudest sense, a kind of nihilism almost on the right, like a kind of awareness that maybe there is secular stagnation, to go back to our earlier arguments. Maybe profitability is going to run its course, and maybe also the wildfires and flooding is going to come pretty close to even the mansions, right? So like, what do we do in this moment but just kind of like really just protect in the crudest sense like our political and economic interests? And this has real effects, including on the liberal establishment. And so I'll just end there. Like, as I said, we're seeing this real like resurgent power and profitability of fossil capital, right? We're also seeing that in these geopolitical conflagrations, security is taking precedence over sustainability. We're seeing liberals much more comfortable with like buttressing the security state than they are with continuing to promote green investment. And those liberals are too, unfortunately in the US especially, in the pockets of also the fossil fuel industry, which has also, not coincidentally, dropped all of its commitments to like net zero by X date, right? So it is a very concerning conjuncture where I don't think it's quite right to say that history moves backwards, but I do feel like we've lost some ground on these very basic issues. And I think that we on the left are going to have to get pretty trenchant in our analysis of fossil capitalism and how it operates politically and economically. And I'm just, again, following Malm and Carton here. We're going to have to understand almost at a psychological level how the ruling class operates when it's in a moment of almost violent nihilism, right? Which includes this carbon cynicism, right? And we'll just use any tactic to protect the wealth that it can amass in the moment and not sort of worry about what happens a few decades later, whether to the planet or to capitalism itself, right? And that almost short-termism that is quite relevant there as well. And so what does the left do here? Do we do what Malm and Carton, I think, might suggest, which is get more confrontational with fossil capital? How do we do that in a moment of heightened state security and the risk of criminalization, right, for those very pipeline blocking activities, right? Do we have a different strategy to deal with the geopolitical crises of our day that don't build up the power of the military-industrial complex and keep us more on track towards a green transition? And then how does all of this, because I've been a bit global north-centric here, interact with what we're seeing out of the global south, which is like a continued desire to do kind of green developmentalism and green industrial policy and leverage their extractive sectors in some cases towards a kind of developmental program in which they are moving up the supply chain into more value-added goods, and they are doing that in increasing coordination with China, which is then itself deepening some of the conflicts between the West and China, right? So just to sort of bring it full circle, that's why we're very much in another moment of kind of reckoning over extractive sectors and the geopolitics of them, the profitability of them, and the social and environmental impacts of them, and whether or not they afford any route to kind of real economic sovereign development for the global South, or whether that is itself a trap and not possible, right? All these questions are very live in our moment, but I think the risks and the stakes are heightened in a way where quite a bit of care is needed in analysis, which is why I think this is, such a good type of conversation to be had, and quite a bit of care and also comradely debate is needed in terms of what our political strategy might be.
Look at all the lovely people.